Police say she offered millions of dollars to have her estranged husband killed and was caught in a sting at a Starbucks. She pleaded guilty, served time, and was still facing new felony charges. And now there's a stunning update in that case, a tragic update, because the woman at the center of that murder for hire plot has been found dead. And the path from that conviction to this moment is raising some shocking new questions. We're on The Case, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Stewart. California equestrian Tatyana Remley once sat across from an undercover officer, calmly discussing how to have her estranged husband killed. Remley was later convicted of orchestrating a multi-million-dollar murder for hire plot against the man who she was divorcing. This was a case that unraveled after a police sting and a suspicious house fire. According to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, investigators say that Remley offered as much as $2 million to have her husband killed. This was a woman with a lot of money, and there was a lot of money just surrounding this case in general. But her conviction was not the end of this story. After serving time and while still facing additional legal trouble, there's been a stunning new development. Tatyana Remley has been found dead. And what led to that moment is why we're now taking another look at this case. So let me set the scene for you, because it seemed like this woman, Tatyana Remley, she just had so much going for her. She lived in a beautiful part of the country in Southern California. She had this love for animals. She had the resources to interact with animals. I mean, horses are not cheap. This was a woman who had money. Tatyana Remley was a California equestrian who, according to court records, once lived a very public and very wealthy lifestyle with her husband, who was named Mark Remley. Court records and reporting show that this couple, they owned multiple high-value properties, and they moved in some pretty elite social and business circles during their marriage. Remley reportedly was a longtime tech executive. He helped grow a software company into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. He later inherited significant wealth through family holdings as well. So we're not talking about somebody who just had that new money through his career. This was a guy that had wealth, that had that old money from his family. A former business partner later described Remley as the driving force behind many of the couple's ventures, telling News Nation that she was often the, quote, ringleader and the one pushing ideas forward, for better or for worse. And I'll get more into that in just a moment, because according to prior court filings and media interviews, the two first met during a chance encounter at a Starbucks in Southern California. Now, Starbucks is a detail that becomes somewhat ironic considering what I'll tell you happened later in this case and in their marriage. Now, the two married in 2011, and they became well known in Southern California after they launched a pretty ambitious venture, an equestrian acrobatic show. Think like Cirque du Soleil, but with horses. You ever hear of dressage? I mean, it was a lot of that. This show, it was called Valitar, and it was at the Del Mar Fairgrounds. That's the home of the San Diego County Fair. Now, according to reporting by the San Diego Union-Tribune at the time, this production, as ambitious as it was and as risky as it was, turned out to be just that, and not in a good way, because this show collapsed after just a handful of performances. And it wasn't just a failure of a show from a reputation standpoint for this couple. It was a failure from a business standpoint, not just for them, but for the vendors and for the performers who were signed to be part of it, because many of them were left unpaid. And when you look at this marriage and what ends up being just a very haunting and tragic story, this show kind of marks the beginning of a long financial and personal unraveling for the Remleys. Former staff later told reporters that the production just burned through millions of dollars and money that came from investors before it collapsed. It forced the liquidation of assets, and it triggered bankruptcy proceedings. One former associate described the project as chaotic behind the scenes, saying that creative control issues and internal conflict plagued this show well before opening night. In 2017, Tatyana and Mark Remley appeared on the Showtime documentary series Naked SNCTM, which followed members of an exclusive invitation-only sex club known for its partner-sharing lifestyle. Now, on the show, both openly talked about their relationship, describing sex as central to their marriage and portraying themselves as thrill seekers drawn to risk and excess. In one episode, Remley described herself as someone who liked to push limits. Mark said that intimacy and experimentation were the core of their relationship. Those statements later resurfaced as investigators and former associates tried to just understand this couple's dynamic because, no judgment here. I think it's fair to say that they weren't living a typical lifestyle. Now, former business associates say that period of time, we're talking around 2017, also marked another turning point for the Remleys because you have a former partner, his name is Eric Martonovich, and he went on News Nation and he talked about how the lifestyle depicted on the show actually mirrored what he had personally witnessed behind the scenes. This wasn't some reality TV show that didn't show reality. He says it was actually incredibly accurate to what this couple was. He described the couple's private lifestyle as increasingly chaotic, boundary pushing, and difficult for others in their orbit to navigate. And that's also saying a lot considering the high rolling lifestyle that they were navigating that people knew them through. Now, that same source also claimed that the couple attempted to draw friends and associates into their personal lives in ways that many considered uncomfortable. That includes invitations that blurred professional, social, and intimate boundaries, something that he said ultimately led to him cutting ties entirely with the Remleys. According to that former associate, Remley often crafted a carefully controlled public persona. He told News Nation that Tatyana presented herself as a larger-than-life character. At times, she adopted a Russian-inspired identity and aliases, which he said he believed was manufactured rather than authentic, describing it as part performance, part self-invention. Now, the Showtime series, which has since ended, later became a reference point for investigators and media as questions mounted about power, control, and the psychological dynamics inside the marriage. Over the next decade, court filings show that the couple's marriage was repeatedly on and off with multiple separations and reconciliations before they ultimately filed for divorce. Now, in divorce filings, Remley accused her husband of abuse. Those are allegations that he repeatedly denied. Eric Martonovich, the man who went on News Nation, he said he did not believe that Mark Remley orchestrated the abuse that Tatyana Remley described. Instead, he claims Tatyana was often the one, quote, trying to get people to do things, and asserting that dynamic fit a long-standing pattern that he had personally witnessed. Things then escalated dramatically in the summer of 2023. According to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, deputies were called on July 2nd, 2023, to a house fire at the couple's ranch-style home in unincorporated San Diego County. When deputies arrived, they contacted Tatyana Remley at that property, and they said that they found her in possession of multiple firearms and ammunition. So now this situation of a couple that was going through a divorce, that had separated, maybe a toxic marriage coming to an end, certainly people who push boundaries, especially according to friends Tatyana, now we're talking about guns. So this is getting scary. Tatyana was arrested that night on weapons-related charges, and arson investigators were brought in to examine this fire. But that house fire was only the beginning. The following day, authorities say investigators received information that Remley was attempting to hire someone to kill Mark, her estranged husband. According to the Sheriff's Department, a mutual acquaintance alerted Mark Remley, who then went to police. Detectives launched a murder-for-hire investigation, and they arranged a sting. On August 2nd, 2023, according to law enforcement, Remley met with an undercover sheriff's detective who was posing as a hitman at a Starbucks in San Diego County. Remember that Starbucks is actually where Mark ended up meeting Tatyana in a chance encounter, and that is how their relationship and really this entire story began. Authorities allege that during the meeting, Remley, Tatyana, she provided detailed instructions about how she wanted her husband killed. and how his body should be disposed of. She was getting incredibly specific. Investigators say that she offered a multi-million-dollar payment, and she brought firearms and U.S. currency as a down payment. So there is some key evidence that we often see police get in cases where they are posing as someone like a hitman and are trying to get someone arrested who is looking for a murder for hire. Tatyana was arrested at the scene. She was charged with solicitation of murder and multiple weapons offenses. Now, according to court records, she later pleaded guilty to solicitation of murder, and she was sentenced to 3 years and 8 months in state prison. Reporting from NBC San Diego and People indicates that she ultimately served about a year before she was released, but even after serving time, her legal issues were not done. According to the San Diego County District Attorney's Office, Remley was arrested again in September in connection with the earlier house fire, and she was charged with felony arson. She pleaded not guilty, and she was awaiting a future court date. But then, just as the case appeared headed back to court, Tatyana Remley was found dead. Authorities confirmed that Remley was found on December 18th outside of a bar, though no further details have been provided. But officials did later say that her death was being investigated and had been ruled as self-induced. Law enforcement has not released extensive details about her death, and authorities have said there's no indication that anyone else was involved. Join us now to talk about this case is Detective Eric Barnes. It's always great to have you on Law and Crime. This story has a lot of twists, a lot of turns, a lot of layers to it, kind of the money aspect of it, which always grabs people's attention. From a law enforcement perspective, just kind of looking at this story from start to now finish, what stood out to you?
You know, it's another situation where you see someone that gets involved in, a crime and probably has very little experience dealing with crime, has very little experience in, dealing with this level of crime. This is a very elevated level. Criminals typically graduate to murder. You don't just step right into, planning and orchestrating a murder. And it comes, you look at the root cause and motivation for this, it looks like it was financially motivated.
Yeah, and they apparently lived a pretty eccentric lifestyle, to say the least, and they have this like horse show that bombed, and they, you start to see the financial stresses have an impact. She ends up going to a Starbucks, meeting a police officer who she believes was a hitman. And I noticed that in what police had in the case against her was, money she brought with her. She brought a gun to this meeting. What goes into, beyond just her perhaps being recorded saying that I want somebody dead, what do you actually need to have when you're building a case against someone who's going out there thinking that they're going to hire a hitman for murder?
This is a very important phase of the investigation. What you obviously want to do, because you're tiptoeing on the line of entrapment, if the conversation is one-sided and it's law enforcement led, where you're trying to walk her down this path to get her to incriminate herself. So you really just want to let them talk. You want to hear what it is that they are trying to plan, because maybe what they are planning is not a murder for hire. But you want to hear it in their own words, from their own perspective, and capture their thoughts. And that way you'll know exactly what they're trying to do. And also, the very important thing that you will need is an act in furtherance. And that could be a cash payment. It could be a car, somebody providing a vehicle, could be a firearm.
And in this case, she had at least 2 out of the 3 with money and a gun that she brought with her. Can you build a case against someone? Say she didn't bring those things, but she's recorded saying that she wants to hire someone to take out her ex-husband, her estranged husband at the time. Can you still build a case even if you don't have maybe the money that she brought with her or a gun as proof that it's not just words that she wanted to use in building this case?
I think at that point, what you have is a plan. And you're going to need something a little bit more concrete to actually form the conspiracy. Because right now you're just having talks, and it could very easily be defeated by a defense attorney saying, hey, she was having these thoughts, and that's all they were at this time, were just thoughts and conversation, but she actually never wanted to carry out this. And so what the law requires in most states is that there's an act that goes, an overt act, which would be something that's a little more than just a verbal conversation or a thought. You're going to need something more concrete that you can actually put your hands on, which again, like I said, would be payment in most times.
When you talk about it, it seems that she doesn't have this, history of, she's not a career criminal. And I know you said like people typically graduate to murder, and in this case, they're at a Starbucks. She's brought everything that the person she thought was a hitman was going to bring. I guess what are some of the rookie moves when you look at her? Not to use a sports term, but kind of some of the rookie moves of someone who, in reality, when we see like a contract killing, what someone wouldn't actually do if they were a seasoned.
You know, typically seasoned criminals, the first time they meet somebody, they're not going to commit to committing a crime with them. They're going to want to learn a little bit about them because ultimately their success in getting away with the murder for hire is going to hinge on how good your shooter is, how good your hitman is, how calculated he is. One mistake by the hitman can lead to everybody ending up going to prison. So it's almost like an interview process. And I think with her, in this case in particular, there was a financial motivation. And I think her downfall, it seemed also there was a hint of desperation that she not only was looking for somebody to make it happen, but she wanted it to happen as soon as possible. And I think whenever you rush your planning and, you're very, you're focused on getting to a date and time versus carefully planning out, there's going to be a lot of mistakes made.
She offered $2 million, up to $2 million, to this police officer that she thought was a hitman. That is a massive amount of money. I mean, I know we've covered cases where, very similar kind of sting operation by police, but it's someone in a lower tax bracket and they're offering like $50,000. But to hear a $2 million number, like what does that tell you about her mindset at the time that she was willing to offer this much money to allegedly kill her husband?
Chris, that amount of money speaks volumes to where her mindset was. She wasn't halfway. This is not just some idea that she's going back and forth with. She's committed. And she's ready for a hitman to be as committed as she is. And so that $2 million bounty is just there to make sure that, hey, once we get this started, I want to get it done. Like I don't need you freezing up. I don't need you backdooring. I need you to be 100% committed, and I'm going to pay you well.
At the same time, it's one of these where like if she was so desperate to have her husband killed and have someone else do it for $2 million, you worry, I'm sure for police as she leaves that meeting is like, is this someone who's going to take the gun and then she's going to go do it herself? I guess what's the difference typically between people who sadly in domestic situations, when things get so bad and so toxic, they put it in their own hands compared to someone who actually, the motivation to go out there and think that they can go and hire a hitman?
Unfortunately, there are a lot of people that are caught up in domestic situations that they want to get away from and just really don't know how to do it. And I think the majority of those individuals would rather be victimized than to hurt someone else. And I think that in this case in particular, what stood out to me, I saw that there was allegations of domestic violence, and I'm not saying that wasn't reliable or true, but I also believe that what motivated this case was the financial part, that because she very easily could have walked away from him. They had already started a divorce process. She could have moved on with her life without killing him. And unfortunately, killing him was a way to provide more financial means for her. And so, divorce is a way to escape the domestic violence, but you need him dead in order for the payout.
After a meeting like this, when you run a sting operation and, she's saying some very concerning things, she clearly has the proof that she's not just talking, that she wants this actually done, and she leaves that Starbucks. Like, what happens next for law enforcement? Because I'm sure there could be that fear that this is someone so desperate that maybe she crosses that limit and then she does it herself.
An intense surveillance operation has to take place. Because at this point, it's not too far-fetched to believe that maybe she's having this conversation with multiple people and she's just going to go with whoever answers the phone first. So now that you're aware, you've been made aware of the threat, it is your responsibility to make sure you keep her under surveillance until you're able to get her in custody. Because like you said, at any point in time, she could take it in her own hands or she could find someone that's willing to move a little faster.
And, the cliche line is like money doesn't buy happiness. And there's been a lot of examples. I mean, people win the lottery and they end up going into bankruptcy and being depressed and all of that. But You also look at someone like this, and it seems like she had so many things going for her. She had all the material possessions that you would want to have. How common is it that you see people in this level of tax bracket where it just doesn't seem like money can solve their problems?
You know, I think that, another saying that I think very much plays into this case is not how much you make, but how much you spend. And so you can have high levels of income, but the lifestyle that comes with it often gets people trapped into wanting to continue this stigma and being able to keep up with the Joneses. And I think that's what was important to her. She had been living at a certain level, and I think there may have been some concerns that after she was divorced, if she was going to be able to continue to have this lavish lifestyle. And so what was more important to her at the time was continuing the lifestyle versus, actually having her husband alive.
And she ends up spending roughly a year in prison. She was sentenced to 3 for the murder for hire plot and everything that went down at the Starbucks, but she was still facing charges related to this alleged arson at a home, which goes back a couple of years. Why is it that you see kind of a staggering of the investigations where here she is pleading guilty to an incredibly serious charge of trying to solicit someone to kill her estranged husband, but then even when she gets out, she still has these legal headaches that she's going through for another very serious charge in an alleged arson. But why is it that something like that kind of goes out in this staggered approach as opposed to, and maybe her attorney couldn't push the limit in trying to get just everything resolved all at once?
I was a bit intrigued by that as well. Typically what will happen, you'll have an individual come in, they're facing multiple charges, and you'll have one plea. Most prosecutors are going to want to get the cases resolved as easy as possible. So once somebody confesses guilt, you typically try to get them to confess guilt on all cases, because at that point they're waving the white flag. They're saying, hey, you got me. And so you want to try to clean up as much as you can without having to get in the courtroom. And so I was really intrigued on that. The only thing that I could think of in this case is that potentially some of these cases may be prosecuted in different courtrooms. It could be that the arson case may be handled by a different jurisdiction.
Yeah, and you wonder too, I know arson cases, take a good amount of time. Sadly, she was going to face these charges. She ends up, according to police, taking her own life. So that case will never be resolved, or I guess you could say it's resolved now. But I guess, what do you just make of how this story comes to an end? And it just seems like this, there's a lot of it that is tragic, no matter how anybody feels about her. It seems like she had this great life going for her. Marriage ends up in disaster. They put on this horse show. That was a disaster, cost them millions of dollars. And then, eventually you kind of just see this spiral, continuing on. In law enforcement, how often do you see people kind of go down that path that it's like once one thing goes bad, it's just one thing after another?
It is super unfortunate. And I think that what is super interesting about these type of cases, how everybody, typically someone appears normal. They appear to have the life that, some people are in less fortunate situations aspire to have. And so you spend your life putting in hard work, making sacrifices to get to a certain point, and things start to fall apart. And I think it's just that one bad seed or that one bad idea, how it just unravels and kind of you have a snowball effect. One bad decision leads to another bad decision, which leads to an arrest. Now you're fighting charges, and now you plead guilty, you go to prison. And so this lifestyle that you were fighting so hard to maintain and to have has been taken away from you. You've experienced prison, and now what is on the other side of this arson charge could be more prison time. And ultimately, as sad as it is, she made a decision that she definitely didn't want to be behind bars anymore.
Yeah, and you talk about, her losing the, luxurious lifestyle she seemed to have just through the financial issues with her marriage. Going back to prison, that is, I'm sure, something that really made things difficult for her. When it comes to, I always find it fascinating with murder for hire cases, because I think in a lot of times, we only really hear about it when the person gets arrested. And you don't often hear about, this mysterious figure who you meet up with at a Starbucks over a latte, where you would actually have this conversation. Not that I think I've asked you this in the past, but it's are contract killers real? Because you see in the movies, the hitman, the guy that shows up. But often it just doesn't feel like I see a lot of those cases where that person actually exists. I mean, in law enforcement, I mean, how common is it to actually have that figure in real life who would show up at a Starbucks asking for $2 million and says, look, this is what I do for a living, and I'm going to go take care of this for you?
And Chris, I think that the average American, the only experience they have with a hitman is going to be through some Hollywood script, or some Oxygen movie. But there are true hitmen that do exist, but they exist in the dark underworld of criminality. You're going to have to actually be in a day-to-day world of committing crimes and knowing that, okay, this guy has a criminal resume for this type of thing. And typically, those guys that are willing to do that have those resumes, they're not going to meet you at a Starbucks because you're in the public eye. And there's potential witnesses that if someone overhears this conversation, they're going to tell someone that what they heard. And now there's videotape. So just the mindset of dealing with someone who would be willing to commit a murder, the average citizen is not going to know that individual. And I think it's equally as dangerous. And in this situation, it was good that someone passed the information and they weren't willing to do it. Because $2 million, who couldn't use $2 million, right? And, I think that the individual that passed the tip on to the police, I commend them for speaking up and saying something, because that ultimately helps save someone's life.
Yeah, I mean, you just think of like the Starbucks part of it for me is like there's definitely cameras in there. Everybody's probably listening. I mean, I don't know how big this Starbucks was, but it's like you can hear anybody's conversation, in Starbucks. The idea that you'd be talking about a contract killing and that would be something that would be seen as covert is just bizarre. But obviously this story took a very, another tragic turn, and it's taken several tragic turns along the way. Detective Eric Barnes, it's always great to have you on Law and Crime. Thanks for breaking this down with us.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks for having me.
That will do it for On the Case, presented by Law and Crime. Subscribe to us on YouTube and Spotify. I'm Chris Stewart. We'll see you next time.